Okay, we are now interviewing Mr. Murray.
Hello.
Okay, Mr. Murray, how does the literature of the 1920s reflect the time period in which it was produced?
I think if you look at the economic boom that was happening during the 20s with the stock market bubble prior to the crash, you can say that a lot of the literature reflects that, especially if you look at classics like The Great Gatsby, which is all about that kind of new money versus old money American mentality. There were the people who were making all of their money who were looked down upon by the people who had come from Europe, had tons of money already, but there's still this East Coast elitism versus the American West where people were making a lot of money. So it was a lot about money, it was a lot about social class, but it was a very moneyed kind of privileged literature.
So how does the literature reflect the time period of the 1930s?
So the 30s, everything falls apart, right? 29, everything falls apart. And so the literature of the 30s much more reflects the piecing together of America again, right? Taking everything had kind of fallen apart, that opulence. And so now the 30s literature was trying to piece that back together. So much more about working class people trying to figure out how to put America back together.
What impact did World War I have on literature?
So I think if you think of, you guys are supposed to be talking about the Lost Generation, right? Particular. So if you think about Hemingway and how Hemingway started with a book called The Movable Feast, right, which is about him being an expat in Europe. I don't think World War I impacted literature differently than war impacts literature. I think you see a lot of people who go to war, see all of these horrible things happen, and basically spend the rest of their lives trying to deal with those things. And for Hemingway, you drop out of American society, you move to Europe, you kind of live this, again, privilege, all about privilege, isn't it? You live this kind of privileged life where you get to travel around, you get to go to bullfights in Spain and do all this other stuff, and at some level try to avoid dealing with, and at the same time deal with the atrocities that you committed or saw or whatever during the war.
How does literature and poetry from the Harlem Renaissance reflect social trends and patterns of the time period?
Then I have to default again to the well-known people, your Langston Hughes, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, that there was a promise seemingly made to former slaves or slaves when they were freed, right, 40 acres and a mule. Everybody gets 40 acres and a mule, which did not end up being true. And I think in the 20s you start to see, A, the literature be recognized, but also the facing of that issue, that these people were promised something that was never really given to them, and in fact, in a lot of cases, the situations they were put into was as bad as slavery that they'd come out of. So I think you see a lot more of the addressing of that issue with people like Richard Wright and people like Langston Hughes talking about, like, hey, we really got a bad deal.
Hi, I'm Mr. Powelson. I teach English at Essex High School.
So, Mr. Powelson, what piece of literature do you think best represents this time period of 1920s and the 1930s?
I think the one that comes right to mind to me for just before that World War I literature is a poem by Wilfred Owen, and it's called Dulce Decorum Est. And before World War I think a lot of the literature that talked about war tended to glorify it. For instance, in the Civil War in this country, most of the literature was of that sort. It was a noble thing to be in war. People died bravely and that sort of thing. And right after the Civil War was over, Stephen Crane wrote Red Badge of Courage, which is sometimes thought as the first realistic novel of war. And he portrayed not generals and the leaders of the war doing noble things, but he talked about a private and what happened to him, and the idea of running away from battle in fear and seeing corpses, and he wrote about the horrors of war. And that sort of thing came out again and surfaced again in World War I. There were people that certainly wrote that type of poetry, but there's also a continuation of what Stephen Crane was noticing about the Civil War. And there's a poem by Wilfred Owen, who was a British poet, but I think it fits a lot of other poets of that era. And the poem's called Dulce Decorum Est, which is Latin for how sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country, which sounds at first like a noble thing, but actually he's being very ironic and maybe even sarcastic about it. And his point is really that it's not sweet and fitting to to die for one's country. In fact, his poem is about men dying of gas poisoning in the trenches of World War I. So when he says it's sweet and fitting to die for one's country, it's really just the opposite. So we had that happening in World War I, and then as World War I ended and we entered the 20s, the U.S. was in an era of general prosperity, and things picked up quite a bit. And the novel that I see that really represents that represents that era, the 20s, is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. And in The Great Gatsby, it focuses on the life of the wealthy and the different issues and things that they encounter. Mostly are social things. It's about a man who is trying to regain a lost love, and he does it by buying things. He buys a mansion to try and impress her. He hosts huge parties to try and impress her and win her love back. And so that represented a whole different big shift in focus, toward this prosperous time where people have lots of money. Although there is a kind of a dark side to it as well. Toward the end of the novel, Fitzgerald writes about the fact that the people in the novel were the type who tended to sort of run over the people of less means and just leave them in their wake and leave them to clean up the messes that they had made. So kind of a hint that this was not quite what we were thinking it really was, but it was the way that the 20s was, part of the 20s was portrayed in literature. When I think of The Great Gatsby as kind of standing for a lot of the things that happened in the 20s, and then we moved to the 30s, and I think the book that really represents that era is Grapes of Wrath. Both of these books we happen to teach here. But Grapes of Wrath is about a family who falls in hard times, not necessarily from the stock market crash so much, but just from the weather. They're farmers in Oklahoma, and the weather turns dry on them. They can't raise crops, and they travel west to California in hopes of making it. And they get to California and discover that it's not the promised land that they had thought it would be. And so that book to me represents the era of the 30s, of some disillusionment, of difficult times. And I think it also represents the division between the haves and the have-nots, because there were certainly people in California portrayed as the wealthy landowners, the people who, and it's more Southern California than Northern California, but the wealthy landowners who were raising grapes and other products, other produce, and they were the ones with the money, and they were the ones that were unwilling to pay the workers hardly anything for their work. They provided them with very little housing, and what housing they provided, the conditions were atrocious. And so we had the family, and the name of the family is the Jode family, on the one hand, representing a lot of the migrant families, people who had to leave their land, and we had the people in California who had lots of money and were basically taking advantage of the situation. The Jodes were also cast off their land by wealthy landowners as well, people who brought in a way, technology for that era in the form of tractors and that sort of thing to farm the land and move the Jodes off. And in a way, it echoes a little bit of what we've seen here in this country, where a lot of jobs and things are sent to China because it's cheaper. And back in the 30s, a lot of the work that was done on the farms was done mechanically because it was cheaper, and the role of people became diminished.
I'm Kate Frisbee. I teach American Lit, World Lit, and Public Speaking at Essex High School.
Ms. Frisbee, how does literature and poetry from the Harlem Renaissance reflect social trends and patterns of the time period?
It definitely shows up in the literature, and you can see it because most black people weren't published writers before the 1920s and the 30s. It was an oddity. So during the Harlem Renaissance, all of a sudden we get this influx of the black voice in America. And what are they writing about? They're writing about racism, and they're writing about blues music and the Great Migration, this change of their geography. They're writing about their past and what they want out of their future and what America looks like to them. So it shows up in all poetry, Langston Hughes, County Cullen, Claude McKay.
What was the effect of an increase in urban population on literature?
The Great Migration, where you had millions of African Americans moving from the South to the urban cities of the North, changed everything because they became published writers. There was a venue for their art, and their voice was heard all of a sudden. There was signs of their presence all of a sudden in literature and art. And so now that these men and women are living in these urban cities in the North and are free to actually pursue art and are encouraged to, they all of a sudden have a voice. So that's
what effect did the economic collapse in the 1930s have on literature?
Well, in this case, for the Harlem Renaissance, it's what ended it. It was a big part of the reason that the Harlem Renaissance died in the 1930s is because of the Great Depression.